If you've been around AOT discourse for the past few years, you know just how devising the ending to this story has been. I got this idea from watching another video talking about this iceberg, albeit a bit more vulgar one, suggesting that other people attempt to tackle this iceberg just like he did to provide more opinions and better dialogue. Today I'm going to be doing just that. I'm going to be doing my best to try to stick to dialogue and statements made strictly in the canon source material. I'm going to do my best to not use as many author statements as I can, because Isayama has been known to switch up and contradict himself in different interviews as he changes ideas. Obviously, heavy spoiler warning for the entire series. I highly recommend you guys comment on things if you disagree with them, because I actually want to see if people have opposing ideas to these points. But yeah, let's get into this. Mikasa walked back to parody. This has actually been somewhat of a meme for some time, if you've probably seen like some image of Mikasa on a boat carrying Eren's head. But it's referring to after the final battle, we see Armin and Mikasa talking about giving Eren a proper burial. They seem to agree on a place, which ends up being the tree back on parody, as we see later in 139. This raises the question, how did she even get back to the island? We see her walking away from Armin and the group, so unless she just walked away for theatrical effect and just turned around, we don't even see anything past that point. Even if we forget everything else and we just say she spawns back on the island, she's a member of the Alliance, and she is returning with the head of the hope of the entire island. I don't think that the island would be very welcoming to that. Obviously, you know, maybe they couldn't do anything because it's Mikasa, but whatever. This is more of a random, unexplained thing in the very last chapter of the series, and it's always been more of like a funny, random thing to point out than anything too crazy. Absurd final battle plot armor. I'm assuming this is talking about the lack of casualties in the final battle. This was definitely something I noticed, even on my first reading when the ending first came out all those years ago. I was like, dang, you know, this is AOT and nobody died in the final fight? That's pretty crazy. But rereading, you can definitely observe how the traditional battle strategy that had outlined previous arcs like Trost or Battle for Shiganshina are pretty much absent in this battle. There are multiple points in the story where even the strongest non-shifter characters like Levi and Mikasa are hindered by stuff like dull blades or the lack of gas in their ODM gear, where they have to switch out with other people just to keep going. Certain battles have literally hindered on the idea that they don't have an infinite amount of supplies and resources, no matter how much strength an individual may possess. This just isn't the case in the final battle. The Alliance battles an untold number of ancient titans formed from the Warhammer Titan hardening, and they only mention their gear being damaged like once or twice, and then they get saved immediately after and they never talk about it again. They fight on top of Eren, are saved by Falco, return back to fight again, and no one ever brings up a concern of gas like one time. Like, they're just on infinite gas apparently. And all of these are instances obviously of plot convenience. Even if I was to bring up these points, they aren't actual examples of like a break in story rules or logic or anything. Ymir, however, we just talked about the Ancient Titans, definitely is, and we'll get to that later on. Jean Casa canon. This was just kind of weird. After the extra pages came out, there was this huge debate on whether this guy was actually Jean or some random person. As I said before, I'm trying to avoid all shipping dialogue, so the only problem with this would be if this guy actually is Jean. It would be kind of weird for him to be with Mikasa after saying this in 139, and then we seemingly see Mikasa never get over Eren. Either way, just kind of weird, nothing too crazy. Falco's Titan plot convenience. I'm not going to be arguing the mechanics of Annie's female or Zeke's beast Titan explanation, because at the best, the plot convenience of royal blood could explain away any variables, and I don't really want to get into that because we're never really told the limits of royal blood. Rather, the logic of how Falco's Titan was used only adds to the previous point that we talked about, the final battle. Falco, who on his second transformation, by the way, was able to fully control his Titan, performing insane evasive aerial maneuvers just like it was nothing, and he had basically near infinite stamina. Keep in mind that controlling your Titan on the second transformation is basically never seen in the series. Even if we wanted to consider him some type of Titan prodigy, he would not be operating like he had transformed 100 times up to that point. It was just another strange thing that happened that only served to enable a more fair battle against Eren, because you realize that Eren was basically undefeatable unless you add in all these separate things. Dina's twist, pointless shock value. I'll go into this more on a later point, but the Dina twist doesn't really serve a purpose in the story, and it actually creates more problems than it solves. We already had an in-universe established reason for why Dina would be there in chapter 1, and even if you wanted to say, oh, Bert was there, we didn't know about that in chapter 1, the established in-universe reason already explained why she would ignore Bert, and it would also explain why she appeared in season 2. This twist breaks both of those, and it also breaks something much bigger. Mikasa-Ymir connection forced and illogical. This is one of the more contentious points, and rather than arguing it all out here, I just want to mention what Mikasa states about Ymir. She says that Ymir has been peeking into her head all this time, and that was the reason for her headaches. This raises an interesting question that I want everybody to be thinking about as we continue this video. Why would Ymir look at certain moments that we see her head throbbing throughout the manga, and was this always the context that was included in these moments? For example, when Armin is about to die, her head throbs. When Eren was eaten and Trost, her head throbs. These are all moments where she thinks she's about to lose her family. Someone close to her is about to die. Is this better explained now as a trauma response because, she lost her family and she thinks she's going to lose her family again? Or is it Ymir using the Founder's power on an Ackerman to peek into her head whenever she's about to lose her family? Which one sounds more plausible to you? Just think about that. This also sets up a precedent with Ymir's powers that we will discuss later. Eren lobotomized only when convenient. This is definitely a more meta complaint, as the inclusion of Eren saying that his head is messed up and that he can see the past and future at once can just essentially be used to sweep away anything and everything. Like, why did he move Dina? He doesn't know. Why did Ymir choose Mikasa? He doesn't know, only Ymir knows that one. So from now on, I'm going to be referring to this concept as a 4D when talking about seeing both the past and future at once. It basically makes it so that Eren can do anything he wants throughout the story, because at this point the Founder has seemingly infinite unbound power, but he can also do nothing at the same time. Like, he doesn't know what he's doing, so he can't actually take action. It's not something that makes the story any easier to grasp in any sense of the word. Mikasa Azumabito plotline dropped / pointless. This is more trivial in my eyes. It's more of a minor letdown than anything that really affects the plot. It just kind of seemed random and thrown in there at the end to create a link between one of our 3 main characters and the only foreign land that could be involved with parody. I guess you could say it served its purpose in that regard, but for it to be introduced in the story so late, you could have expected a little bit more payoff. Ackerman memory manipulation retconned. Now, this is our first big one. We have to be very careful with sticking strictly to the exact ramifications of statements by characters in the story. In chapter 65, Kenny's grandfather tells him that minority bloodlines were immune or not affected by memory manipulation. These 2 bloodlines are given to us as the Asians and the Ackerman family. He then goes on to say that the king had to use other means to silence these minority bloodlines, as they were not affected by the power of the Titans. This makes sense as we see them pushed to extinction throughout the story, which would be the other means that the king had to use. This makes sense with what we know in the story. The Ackermans are basically Titans in human form, and they can't be turned into shifters, which establishes that they are different than the average person who can be affected by Titan powers. So it seems to make no sense that Mikasa later on was affected by the founding Titan's powers in 2 separate instances later in the story. First, when she's pulled directly into paths by the founding Titan's power, as explicitly stated by Eren. He literally says, "I'm using the founding Titan's power to do this, guys." This would directly contradict the statement made previously that Ackermans and Asians cannot be affected by the Founder's power, because we literally see Eren do it. Mikasa would also be doubly immune for both sides of her bloodline. Even if you wanted to argue that, she's Eldian, so she can be affected a little, it still wouldn't really work. And secondly, when she's brought into the cabin scene later on, whatever your explanation of what this scene actually is, whether you think it's a dream, a false memory, an alternate timeline, whatever, that doesn't really matter. Her wording to Armin later on in 139, when she says that she just remembered, 2 means her memories had been altered. She just remembered 2, which means she had forgotten at some point. It's very easy to say that her memory had clearly been altered. Founding Titan plot holes. This is a very broad statement. I'm not really sure what it's talking about specifically, so I'll just continue talking about the concept of the 4D founder from earlier. It is a little strange for the 4D founder to have existed in all previous founder shifters, as we see none of them acknowledge it. And even when Grisha tells Frida about the Attack Titan's power to see the future memories of its inheritors, she seems super shocked. It doesn't really add up that a 4D founder who has access to all knowledge of Eldians, past and present, could be unaware of such a power that is in one of the 9 Titans that she apparently had once held. We have to assume it's only started when Eren fully activated the founder in 122, meaning that Ymir and Eren were the only 2 founders in history to ever have the 4D aspect, but that creates another issue that we'll talk about later. Dina Twist retconned / original Dina explanation. So earlier I did say that Dina had previously explained motivations. We know that certain abnormal Titans can act differently with extremely strong wills, and that was our given explanation for Dina's actions as a Titan up until that point. She says she was moving towards Grisha and she would find him no matter what, which, you know, in chapter 1 Grisha was right there, and then later on in chapter 50 he was again right there. So this would explain why she appeared in both instances. With this new knowledge that it was actually Eren who moved her past Bertolt, we have a few unsettling scenarios to consider. Either A, it was actually Eren all along, meaning not only did he interfere in the story, it was as some people feared, and he just made the story. He moved Dina towards himself in chapter 50 as well to activate the founder for the first time, and he would have unlimited reach, and there's literally no limit to how many of the best moments in the story were just Eren making people do certain things. Like Eren was just playing 4D chess with everybody. Our second scenario suggests that the original reasoning still stays true, which is why Dina finds Eren again in season 2. Okay, this would mean that Eren just did the first move for fun? Or I guess in his given explanation, because he felt compelled by something, which we don't know what something is. This one doesn't really work either and is actually impossible, as Eren's wording basically confirms that this doesn't actually exist. He specifically says he had to do it in order for Bertolt to survive, meaning that even if we go with our first explanation and Dina had some extremely strong bond that made it so she only cared about finding Grisha, apparently it wouldn't have been strong enough and she would have just eaten Bertolt if Eren had done nothing. Meaning that the extremely strong bond that she had that even allowed for her to be an abnormal Titan in the first place wasn't actually real, and she only appeared at the end of season 2 out of pure random chance and convenience. It ends up serving no purpose other than to muddle up an already existing idea and create the determinism versus fate debate that greatly affects Mr. Jaeger himself. Absurd port battle plot armor. So just like earlier when we talked about the final battle, the port battle was completed with absolutely 0 casualties. We are not counting these 2. The standards for these trained soldiers had been set previously, so no one is going to be surprised that Mikasa can take a 1v10 against them, right? But Connie? He just charges in like nothing against like 10 fully trained soldiers, and he comes out without a scratch. Not only that, but the Jaegers, they all kind of act like NPCs and decide that no one is going to shoot the boat until Flock makes his final attempt, right? If their goal was to protect the island, then they literally win by doing any sort of damage to the boat. It seems a little crazy for rational soldiers to say, hey, instead of going to find the boat, let's try to fight Mikasa. Let's do that. Like, what? Royal blood shouldn't be needed post 123 rumbling. This is another problem that has to do with us not really knowing what Eren is doing or in control of post 122. Why did the rumbling stop post 123? We know why Zeke, or any member of Royal Blood, was needed before that point because of the fact that Ymir would only listen to members of the Royal Bloodline as stated by Zeke. But the entire point of that chapter and what Eren did was to free her of this restriction. Zeke is even framed in that chapter to be a parallel to the king, and we see her choose for herself, thus breaking that link. This is even doubled down on later when Armin says not only is it Eren, but it's Ymir as well, and that she wants the rumbling. So why would Zeke be needed? This would go against everything we just said, and it would mean somehow, after 122, Ymir would have regressed and she would need the royal bloodline again. Killing Zeke should in no way affect the rumbling at this point in Ymir's narrative, and it was only true of her character before chapter 122. Kruger would support the rumbling. So out of all the past shifters who show up in chapter 137, I typically see the most controversy surrounding Kruger, and for good reason. If I'm being completely honest, all of this makes no sense, and it sprouts entirely again from Ymir. But if we just assume that all these titans had agencies of their own, and they were still their own characters that we followed throughout the rest of the series, it makes no sense for Kruger, the man who killed and tortured thousands, not just a few, thousands of Eldians in order to continue the Attack Titans mission, which we know is the rumbling, to then turn around after 80% of the world has already been killed and finally say, oh, it's too much. His entire moral code defined sacrifice for the greater good of the future of the Eldian people. And not only that, he was a past inheritor of the Attack Titan, which means there's a good chance he saw into the memories of a pre-122 Eren. He witnessed the racism of the outside world firsthand and secondhand, and all the reasons that drove Eren to believing the rumbling was truly the only choice. And he still decided to pass it on to Grisha. Why would he later on then be like, oh, I actually didn't want this. This is not what I wanted. Eren loving Mikasa is a retcon. Red alert here. We're in shipping territory. As I said earlier, I don't want to use author statements. I'm trying to do it as little as possible, but I think for this topic it is important, because between the dates of 2015 and 2017, we have statements from Isayama defining their relationship and how they feel towards each other. In 2015, he says this: for Eren, rather than a lover, Mikasa's presence is more like a mother to him. This is probably the statement you've seen the most if you've done any sort of research into this shipping debate. But this is a very important statement because in 2015, chapter 50, which was the scarf scene, had already been written and released. And from the story up until this point, this statement seems pretty accurate. The next year, in 2016, he even commented how he thought it would be pitiful if Mikasa's entire life was about Eren, backing that up with several more statements from official guidebooks that imply similar ideas. Clearly, these statements don't work with our outcome given, so at the very least, something changed. From a writing perspective, their relationship was extremely underdeveloped, or at worst, severely misinformed. If the only existing examples of a developing relationship between the two are glances, at best, that we the audience have to interpret, this isn't a substitute for writing actual development or interaction between two characters. This is an important time to remind everyone that foreshadowing does not equal development, especially if it's a big point of contention between these two characters in an established story beat that, even though they have a strong bond, Mikasa constantly doesn't actually understand what Eren is. This is shown later on, even in the later arcs, so even if we wanted to assume that Isayama had changed his mind and that these characters had a new relationship post-time skip, why would he write the Louise arc? He was actually in his bag when writing this parallel arc, because it applies to the entire series. The only problem is that our conclusion just seems to echo that all of that, even as late as he was writing the Louise arc, which is literally in the final 40 chapters, it just seems to echo that all of it was just non-existent and it didn't matter. Armin lost his intelligence. This just refers to how Armin couldn't find another solution to the rumbling and was often reactive instead of proactive post-time skip compared to his pre-time skip version. Now, I actually disagree with this idea, only if we agree that Isayama wrote a world that forced the rumbling to be the only real option, which I think he did. If this is true and the rumbling truly was the only option for Parady's survival, then even Armin, who has been shown to have the highest intelligence in the entire series, would not be able to find another solution. Because of his moral compass, he would also not be able to support the rumbling similar to Hanji, and he would not be willing to kill someone who isn't actively posing a threat to them. This is actually good writing. You could argue that this is the only reason he detonated himself at the Battle of Marley, because Eren forced him to act. He would never take a proactive action to kill someone who didn't pose a threat to him. I don't mind this at all. I think this is great writing for Armin, but in this instance, the table scene, for example, Armin should have showed higher intelligence there. He should have been able to see through Eren's manipulations like he did with Annie in Season 1. Multiple times in the past, he's been able to deduce characters' true intentions without fighting. That's kind of his entire thing. On the table scene, Armin just seems to be the opposite of his character, an antithesis almost, which doesn't really make any sense. And one of the biggest mantras that he said in Season 1 was that someone who can't sacrifice anything will achieve nothing, which kind of contradicts his actions in this arc. But yeah.
Ending misunderstood why Eren did the rumbling.
Eren did the rumbling for his friends, to save the people of Paradis, and to ensure the safety of future generations by stopping the 2,000 years cycle of violence. These are the reasons that Eren continues to regurgitate to us, whether it's through character dialogue or internal monologue. He makes this very clear. The ending says that either A, Eren didn't actually care about the island, he only cared about his friends, which doesn't work, as we know later on in 139, he says that he doesn't even know if his friends are gonna live or not. Now, to be fair, this is mind-broken Eren, so we have no clue if he's actually telling the truth or not, but to say that Eren was just lying because his mind is broken doesn't really make any sense. And Sasha died throughout this process, so either he cares about his friends or he doesn't. Hanji also died, and if we say Hanji is his friend, does he actually care if 2 of his friends died? We have no clue. Or B, he cared about all of these things, but the 40-time founder powers fried his brain so much that he started acting randomly, which, I mean, who would enjoy that? I don't think anybody would enjoy that writing. Eren, along with multiple other characters, including the Alliance members themselves, know that the island is doomed if they stop the rumbling. Eren himself has said that it's the only way to stop the cycle of violence. That's continued for over 2,000 years up to this point. Not even in our story. It's existed for thousands of years that we never see. This will help us segue into the description of our determinism versus fate debate that I'll go into later. Wall Titans retconned. So once the rumbling stops, after Zeke's head is cut off in chapter 138, we see that the Wall Titans just kind of turn off. This doesn't really make sense from what we've previously established about the Titans in the walls. We know from a basic statement that any Titans not directly controlled by the founding Titan will just roam mindlessly. At the beginning of Season 2, we also see that the Titans in the wall are still active Titans. They're just trapped in immense amounts of hardening. It's not like they're just waiting for batteries to jolt themselves awake, unless you're talking about the sun. But it's even why Pastor Nick says to cover them up. It's clear that if they aren't covered, the people inside the walls are in critical danger. Even when obviously at this point, no one in the story is close to activating the Founder's power. More so, people on the ground even comment on the Colossal moving, so it's not like, oh, he just flicked his muscle or something that Hanji saw close up. It's very obvious that he moved, which means that, even after being trapped in the walls for 100+ years, that small amount of sunlight prompted movement. When the rumbling was unleashed in chapter 122, Eren was controlling them as he executed the rumbling. But even if his control of them was severed, which to do that we'd have to ignore the Zeke Royal Blood plot hole from earlier, the Titans should have continued to move. The whole idea behind the rumbling is that it literally is the unstoppable force in this universe. Once it's been activated, the only established way by our in-universe rules to stop it was if Eren or Ymir had voluntarily stopped it themselves. And since we know Eren still continued to fight after this moment, the only answer would be Ymir. And as with everything that comes with Ymir's decision making, this one is just another miss that I'll explain in great detail later. Falco's Titan retcon Titan mechanics in Eren's Season 3 conclusion, made pointless/contradicted. These are both things I already kind of talked about. With Marley's history of Titan mechanics largely unexplained, you could technically explain away Falco's Titan with royal blood shenanigans, and the Eren stuff is just a combination of the strange changes in motivations, especially in 139. Fake conclusion to Zeke's arc. I'm guessing this is directly in line with his death and conversation with Armin in chapter 137. Zeke's entire ideology revolves around his anti-natalism stance, in which he believes that everyone would have been better off if they weren't born and forced to suffer in this terrible world. The message that Armin supposedly bestows upon him in 137 is that it's the little things in life that instead make life worth living. That sounds familiar. It's almost as if Zeke said this very same thing nearly 8 years ago. Zeke had already throughout the story understood the value of focusing on the little enjoyable parts of life, but still strongly believed in his anti-natalist ideology. He even specified that he did it because he wanted to be unlike his father, which meant it was something that had held great importance to him for a long time. Armin talking about something that he already understands and has almost infinite time and paths to contemplate, suddenly changing his mind makes no sense. This results in him never truly being ideologically defeated because his anti-natalism just like, boom, it's done. And his arc ends with him voluntarily choosing death to help the Alliance sever the connection between the royal blood and the Rumbling, controlled by Eren and Ymir, which we already said they shouldn't even need anymore. You see how this gets crazy? Historia character assassination. I will only be talking about the information we are given in the story and what that leaves us with because, like I said, we're in shipping territory again, blah blah blah. When her pregnancy subplot is first introduced, we're given this information by a group of drunk MPs. It's important to understand that this scene is literally written to be all lies. All of the information in this conversation ends up being false, and this is metaphorically shown by the fact that the entire time this conversation is happening, they're drinking Zeke's wine unknowingly. Now, this conversation has been analyzed by every single shipper to ever grace this series, but I think that there are several things that have been severely overlooked. One of the MPs specifically states that there is no need to understand her relationship to the farmer, which is a very strange piece of dialogue for Isayama to include. And that immediately gives us a suggestion that someone, who at the time we were to believe was Yelena, told her to get pregnant to avoid being fed to Zeke. Now we know this is absolutely false. Historia was never in any danger as she was protected by both Eren and Zeke's wine plan. The MPs had no knowledge of either of these things and thus come to an incorrect conclusion. This is the first thing that they get wrong. He then asks about the timing of the pregnancy. They think it's to delay her being eaten, which, as we said, it isn't. But not only was the information given incorrectly to these MPs, but also to all of our other significant main characters. Levi says that she's due in a few months, when in reality, she is way ahead of that schedule, giving birth during the Rumbling, which would start not long after he made this statement. That's the second thing that's wrong. Then they decide it had to have been Yelena, because she's the craftiest among Zeke's underling. That's the third thing wrong, as we know it was Eren. Finally, they even add that there's no actual evidence of this. This dialogue can technically be interpreted in a few different ways. You can see it as them saying there's no evidence for her getting pregnant to save herself, or there's no evidence for her getting pregnant at all. So I won't stress this one specifically, but it is interesting that it's there. Finally, at the end of this conversation, we see him emphasize how this all puts Historia at danger, and the final statement laments that this world is done for if you go by that logic, almost as if implying that because Historia had been put in danger, the future was already set. But back to the main point, every single piece of this conversation was framed to be wrong, and we know why. Until 139 came around, and apparently these guys actually got something right. Cool. Because we know that Historia, in her character, would never have a child that wasn't out of love, we have to assume that she loved the farmer, which we are literally never shown. Instead, we are shown quite the opposite, until 139, of course. We also have to rationalize why she would lie about her due date. This is the biggest issue with this entire thing. We literally never got a reason for this, by the way. Why would the MPs be correct about this one thing in the scene dedicated to them being wrong? And this is the reason why this whole mystery was even created in the first place. If you go back and you read the dialogue that's vaguely scattered throughout post-time skip, it leaves you with this feeling of confusion when it comes to Historia's character and all the motivations that went into writing this. Alliance plan doesn't really make sense. It's almost hard for me to classify this as a plan because it really isn't one. They just kind of wanted to stop Eren and then went with the flow, which you could identify as a problem. But the biggest issue here is that some of their logic does end up combining with some of the plot holes we've already talked about, like when Levi says, let's just kill Zeke to stop the rumbling. Coincidentally, this gives him an opportunity to do something that finally concludes his promise to Erwin back in the end of Season 3, while he somehow also knows exactly what to do to stop the rumbling, even though we already said that this shouldn't be the case. They also say over and over again that they're dooming the island, and they don't really have a plan afterwards, so they're doing more reacting than proactively thinking of strategy, which was kind of their entire theme post-time skip. The only difference is that this time, it actually magically works. Eren getting Warhammer was narratively pointless. I strongly disagree with this one, barring one specific point. Eren uses the Warhammer in both his march to Zeke, and it's also used primarily for the body of the Founder and the Ancient Titans that Ymir spawns, so to say that he didn't use the Warhammer Titan isn't true. However, it does bring up the idea again that Eren tried his hardest to lose on purpose, which doesn't make sense. We know that the Alliance had no Jaw Titan, so Eren could have easily just put himself in a crystal and gotten a free W. That's the only real issue that I have with the Warhammer powers. Levi's injuries didn't matter, plus Ackerman healing retcon. If you didn't realize, the Ackermans, Levi especially, got some insane durability buffs post-time skip. Way back when, if you guys remember during the Female Titan initial battle, Levi rolls his ankle and is literally out of commission for an entire arc. He is not present for the Clash of the Titans. He's the entire reason we had to get Eren's suicide charge, simply because he's not out there. Fast forward, and he takes a fully in his face Thunder Spear, which has been shown to possess power to blow up the armored Titan's armor, and he somehow survives. What? Even if we grant him this survival, remember, he was out forever with just a tweaked ankle. If that's the scale of our Ackerman regen powers, how is he now doing this in the final fight like it was nothing after getting a 10 times, probably 100 times worse injury? Unless Hanji somehow slipped him a Senzu Bean, I do not know what happened. Hanji's death was forced / pointless. Here I disagree with half of this. In a way, Hanji had been entirely self-critical of herself and was more hyper-aware of the Alliance's failures than any other character. She morally couldn't agree with genocide, but also understood the ramifications of stopping it. I view her death more as her taking a way out. It was a situation that she, as a leader forced into her position, found herself unable to reckon with, and she decided to concede. I think this is actually a fantastic way, writing-wise, to conclude a scientist's character, someone who is probably entirely too analytical in any given situation, and could end it all just focusing on her greatest joy, as that is a true scientist's nature. It's kind of like the trolley problem. You can choose to save one person, or you can choose the 5. A lot of people only think there's 2 options here, but the third overlooked option is to do nothing. Sure, someone is gonna die if you do nothing, either 1 or the 5, but by doing nothing, you yourself weren't responsible for someone's death. You didn't kill someone. By making this decision, Hanji doesn't doom the rest of the world or her island. She chooses to kill no one. Admittedly, this is made a little weaker by Hanji making the choice to kill people when fighting at the port, but if we just ignore that, this is, in my opinion, great writing. But what doesn't make sense here is what leads up to it. How is Flock alive? Sure, he's an insanely trained soldier, but he was literally shot with a sniper by Gabby and was bleeding out while falling through the air. Even if he managed to somehow stay alive to swim to the boat, there was no way for him to stop the bleeding, and he should have bled out, especially as he's dragged through the sea. Much less should he have the strength to pull himself up and fire off shots. This does make the situation itself seem a bit forced to get Hanji into this position, but I don't think the motivation behind Hanji's death is bad at all. I actually think it's quite good. Tonally dissonant, Marvel-esque dialogue. Attack on Titan's humor has always been a bit jarring, but in past arcs, it was almost always well placed. That's the biggest distinction. Read through Return to Shiganshina, and it's near impossible to find many moments where the direness of a situation is immediately met with some random comedic cutaway. Now scale up that direness a million times for the Rumbling arc, You would expect the same seriousness for the arc where literal billions of lives are actively being snuffed out, but instead we get some of the weirdest, most out of place jokes in the entire series. The biggest problem is that the tone is just all over the place, and it's not what you'd expect for an arc of such finality like this. Dina Twist broke AOT's model of determinism. Okay, we can finally talk about it. Determinism versus fate. Determinism is the idea that future events are causally determined by prior events or dispositions. For example, if I naturally like pennies, there's a good chance I'm going to be picking up pennies on the ground if I see them. If I don't like pennies, I won't. This is not saying that there is some outside force that compels me to pick up pennies even if I don't want to. That's fate, the development of certain events regardless of someone's desires, as a result of some supernatural power. Attack on Titan had always been a deterministic world up until this point. Eren wanted to be free, so he would fight, therefore it would eventually lead to him doing the rumbling because it's the only way he could be free. So he knew he was going to do the rumbling that he saw in his future memories. This is why he still saves Ramsey, even though he knows he's going to eventually kill them. If it were a world of fate, it wouldn't have mattered whether it was in his nature to save Ramsey or not. Some outside force would have determined whether he did or did not save him. Dina, however, breaks this rule, as Eren literally says he didn't want to do it, and that something made him do it. This is the literal definition of fate. It isn't in his nature to kill his mom. And we already talked about how him even being complicit in the killing of his mom didn't need to happen. It also means that Eren's will, the will that is literally shown to break the chains of paths itself, was basically unimportant, because guess what? Even Eren can't beat fate. Plus, we don't actually know what this something was. We're never told. Was it Ymir? The AOT universe? Isayama himself? Who knows? We're never told. He says that Bertolt, and I quote, could not die there. Why not? This implies that there's some type of set timeline that Eren observed with his 4D power, and he had to make sure that it played out exactly as it did. Again, this brings up the suggestion maybe Eren did just make the story and he's responsible for every single character's death. He went into the past to change something, meaning he was able to somehow temporarily bypass his 4D brain rot to actually take a conscious action. It's such convoluted nonsense. And worst of all, it's contained in like 4 or 5 pages in the final chapter of the series, but its ramifications are literally for every single AOT chapter ever created. Yelena character assassination plus unfinished arc. Yelena is probably the least talked about character in regards to her conclusion, but yeah, I think this refers to her decision to not go with Falco and witness the action, even after she previously said her entire mission was to see the action, which is why we saw her doing it in the Shiganshina battle. Instead, she just chooses to ride out the rest of the story in a boat just sitting there. Like, I feel like this is blatant character assassination. Like, Yelena, get up, what are you doing? Falco Titan destroyed Marley world building? Since Falco said that what he saw in his head flying above the sky was a memory, we have to assume that there was previously a bird Titan that somewhere existed. This is kind of strange, however, as Marley apparently has no knowledge of this Titan ever existing in any point of its history. An officer even explains that a bird Titan would be nice, so Marley, who has the most Titan knowledge, held most of the shifters for a majority of the time that we have access to, has no knowledge of this supposed bird Titan. It makes the world building of Marley's history, at the very least, very unimpressive. Scout Commander doesn't make sense for Armin, only for Jean. I mean, yeah, I don't really think that this is not a plot hole or anything, as the story kind of harps on that. We see Levi and Jean doing more leading during the final battle than anything. And one of the themes of post-time skip was characters trying to fill the boots of others, even if they can't, like Armin or Hanji. Zeke and Armin leaving paths. Here we go, now we get into the nitty-gritty of paths. We talked about Zeke's conclusion earlier, but how did he even escape paths anyways? Does Eren not have any way to keep him in paths, or is this just another example of his mind being messed up or him trying to lose? At the very least, Ymir would have had to let him out, which I guess makes sense if we think she's completely against Eren all of a sudden in chapter 137, but that doesn't even work. Armin also enters paths in one point of time, but somehow exits like time just flowed outside normally. He exits at a completely different spot. This has never been the case with paths. Whenever it's been presented to us, it always had been near instantaneous, with the flow of time either almost or completely haunted. If you go in paths, if you ever leave, you leave at the exact moment you went in. It breaks the established time flow of paths if the Alliance can just keep fighting while Armin is inside of it. He even somehow knows time is still moving outside while inside paths. Port boat conveniently ignored by Jaegers during battle. Talked about this earlier, but yeah, you just destroy the boat and it's a free win. I don't really know why they decided to fight an Ackerman and some Titan shifters instead of doing the one thing that's guaranteed to win in the battle. Dina Twist created Season 2 plot hole. We really can't stop talking about Dina, but this refers specifically to Dina appearing at the end of Season 2. We originally thought that she was there because of her abnormality, but Eren makes this impossible via 139. So why is she there? It's either pure chance, which would make the writing of the scene much weaker, or Eren controlled her again, which we have no way to prove. It's not a plot hole, but it's definitely very bad. Strange Anna eating pie scene.
Oh, this pie? I mean, give me a break. I haven't eaten anything in 4 years. Oh, you're not mad at me? Oh, you want me to join your team? Well, you do realize I've killed hundreds of your people, and I don't regret any of my actions, and I would do it again. Alright, I guess I'll join you. That's some good pie. Wait, what about Levi?
Nonsensical hallucigenia restarts rumbling subplot. This thing is just kind of dumb because we don't really know anything about it in the first place. This point specifically is talking about why the Alliance thought the hallucigenia would restart the rumbling. They already said that killing Zeke would stop the rumbling, and it did. They saw it. So why would they think that this random worm thing that most of them have never seen before could somehow restart it? If this is supposed to be taken as true, that means that we didn't actually need Zeke because he's dead, right? So if the hallucigenia can just reattach to Eren and start the rumbling again, then you already proved 137 wrong. But we see the rumbling stop after he died, which, like, it's so stupid. Boat somehow passed rumbling. Now this is actually one that I've seen almost no one talk about. How did the Alliance manage to get the rumbling to be behind them? Stay with me. We know the Alliance didn't begin their chase until days after the rumbling had already started. Hanji states that the rumbling moves at approximately the pace of a galloping horse, so we'll be using 25 to 30 miles per hour for our speed scale. And they've been continuously walking at this pace without stopping, which means that the Alliance not only would have to make up this colossal distance between them, but surpass it multiple times over in order to somehow actually get in front of them. And that's ignoring trying to get by the rumbling. This also heavily depends on the way you think the rumbling was actually executed and the way that they walked out of the island. I'm going to include a clip from the YouTuber Unique Namosaurus because he explains it really well. His full video will be in the description, which I highly recommend.
I always thought the rumbling started in Paradis and moved out in an expanding circle, so in order to get ahead of the rumbling, they had to pass through a line of Colossal Titans, which they obviously can't and didn't do off screen. The only way I can make sense of it is that the rumbling split into groups and only targeted the continents, allowing the Alliance ship to slip between. But then it's like, if they can do that, why didn't everyone with a ship do that? There's tons of them in the lore. The rumbling would have been escaped way too easily, and the fact that we don't see anyone doing it makes it seem like no one thought of that. Of course, none of the rumbling particularly made sense anyway. The size of the walls and Paradis' comparative size to the rest of the world means there's nowhere near enough Titans for a full rumbling to work. Maybe the idea is the rumbling was supposed to make multiple laps around the planet, but then we're led to believe that 80% of the world died by the time Mali was rumbled. But Mali is the closest continent to Paradis, so it can't have gotten that far despite all of the cultures we saw get rumble. I don't know.
Connie lobotomized. Connie, bro, what are you doing, man? I was never like a big Connie fan. He was obviously comedic relief for a good portion of the show, but he still had a character arc, and he was driven, for the most part, by his motivation to avenge the innocents that lost their lives to the injustices on the island, specifically those who wronged the people of Ragako and his mom. So after this whole arc, with him acting mostly rationally, given his perspective post-time skip, why does he then regard Annie like their long-lost best friends? At the campfire scene, When Yelena is testing the waters by bringing up past actions, why does she not bring up Ragako? Like, Peak is right there. Connie has seemingly decided to forget about all of this, and instead he decides to redirect his anger at Eren. Not to mention when he kills Daz and Samuel at the port battle. Now, the first killing, I understand. He was going to kill Armin, and he did it to protect him. But Samuel was literally there, completely unarmed. Why would you shoot him in the head? I saw someone else mention this, but if you killed him because he was scared that he would pose some type of danger in the next few moments or in the future, this is literally bar for bar what Eren is doing on a larger scale. Paths is not frozen in time for Armin. Like earlier, there should have been no way for Mikasa to free Armin from Paths because it exists outside of time. If Ymir trapped Armin in Paths, then Ymir is the only one who could possibly enable his escape. And if she did, it should be the exact moment he entered. A battle should not be able to take place while the Okapi moves his body around the battlefield. This destroys any concept of a path rule set that had previously been established. Freckles Ymir, which support the rumbling. This one's a little more contentious, and it's a smaller part of a larger whole, but if we believe that the only thing that she cared about was Astoria's safety, and she really doesn't care about who she endangers to ensure that, and stopping the rumbling seemingly would be the last thing on her mind, at this point, we have to assume through the dialogue that stopping the rumbling means death to the island, which means death to Historia. With a full rumbling, Historia's life is completely safe and you're not taking any sort of chance at all, so it's up to you to decide whether Ymir values the life of Historia or billions of people more. Historia pregnancy subplot was nonsense, see earlier. Friendly Ancient Titan lineup makes no sense in universe, only as nostalgia bait. First, I'm going to address the main point. I do agree. If you think about Titan shifters from the past, who would want to protect Marley? Would you not think of every single past Warhammer Titan? Why didn't we see any of them help the Alliance? None of the past brainwashed Marleyan shifters wanted to come back and save their homelands? Maybe even their great ancestors? Obviously, the fact that just Titans we saw in our story that we know came to stop the rumbling is fan service, but that's not indefensible. You know who is, though? Two specific Titans. These two. Grisha and Kruger, what are you guys doing here? We talked earlier about why Kruger would ideologically support the rumbling, but what about Grisha? We know that Grisha hesitated to steal the founder at first. Zeke tells us that Eren had to have shown him something yet to happen. This conversation occurs in chapter 122. That means the only possibilities of things Eren could show Grisha are from the rumbling on. So Eren showed Grisha something that convinced Grisha to go through with stealing the founder, basically ensuring the rumbling would happen, only to later not want the rumbling to actually happen? Forget that we are literally never told what this thing was, and that Eren's that scenery is never truly revealed, but if Grisha would eventually want to stop the rumbling, why would he ever be complicit in starting it in the first place? This is actually a common theme, because you know who else we can apply this logic to? Ymir. The only problem this point addressed was the actual Titans itself, but they couldn't have actually helped the Alliance unless Ymir let them. In my opinion, this is the biggest problem with the entire ending. What is Ymir doing? Nobody knows. First, by Armin, we know that she's in the same boat as Eren initially, and that she does want the rumbling. She is also the one controlling the Ancient Titans. Okay, that's fine. Supposedly, in chapter 137, just like Zeke, she is moved by Armin's words and decides to help them escape as well as the friendly shifters. There's just one problem. Did we already forget that Armin just said that she is the one controlling all the ancients, which means now she's fighting against herself? Either way, the rest of the fight is staged, or Ymir is doing this weird let me play both sides things, which doesn't make any sense. But first on, let's rewind. Remember what I just said. I said that Ymir was somehow convinced to switch up and go against Eren in chapter 137, but for a 4D founder, how is that even possible? She would have access to Armin's entire life and his memories, so if his ideology was so ridiculously powerful, why did she ever want the rumbling in the first place? It puts the story in this weird formulaic problem. If I say x plus y equals 8, and the story tells us that y equals 4, then x can't be 5. If Ymir has 4D powers and can see past and future, then she cannot then switch up in real time, because she's already seen anything and everything that would have convinced her to switch sides. Now you might say that, okay, she didn't have these 4D powers until the founding powers were activated in chapter 122. Okay, sure. If we apply that to the series, then there's no way for her to send the message to Eren from 2,000 years ago, nor peek into Mikasa's head during the series. I'm fine with the latter. As I said earlier, I didn't think it made much sense. But obviously the story states that it did happen, therefore she did have her 4D aspect the entire time. I'll use this as an excuse to also segue into a similar either or issue with Ymir when she's apparently not fully freed in chapter 122. We have to start with the establishment of Ymir's bounds and paths. Retroactively changing the perspective of Ymir's backstory that we had previously, 139 introduces the idea that Ymir actually loved King Fritz, even before she died. Whether the love itself is legitimate or expounded upon, it exists, and is reinforced to be the reason she remains in paths, creating titans for King Fritz for all this time. She continues to follow his will for literal thousands of years, and this is physically and mentally represented by her link to the royal bloodline. This conclusion is further reinforced when Zeke tells us how she sees the royal bloodline. He tells Eren that Ymir sees the bloodline as her masters, enforcing the idea that she obeys them out of her love for King Fritz. Zeke in chapter 122 is shown to physically and ideologically represent the king, in contrast to Eren. He even specifically orders her and mentions the lineage, as he also understands Ymir should be unable to ignore the wishes and orders of a member of the royal bloodline. Ymir is able to ignore Zeke because she is being freed by Eren's words. The chains that bound her in paths, her connection to King Fritz, is physically and mentally shredded in the process, which finally allows her to open her eyes, seeing freedom, and choose to ignore Zeke, by which she is ignoring King Fritz. This represents the end of her connection with Fritz, and proves she had broken free of the royal bloodline's influence on her. This error in logic comes retroactively from the pre-established connection we just made. It attempts to paint the picture that Ymir was not fully freed in 122, and that she still needed to wait for Mikasa in order to break free of her connection to Fritz. Whether you think it's love, slavery, or whatever, the logic doesn't work. Very simply, if Ymir's connection to Fritz still exists in chapter 122, then the events of the rest of the story from 123 to 139 can't happen. If she's waiting all this time for Mikasa, then she's forced to listen to Zeke in chapter 122, just as she had for 2,000 years before, because her connection to Fritz, her love, and thus her connection to the royal bloodline, who represented her master, has not been severed. If the actions play out like they did in 122, Ymir had been freed and Mikasa was not necessary. If they played out as 139 suggests, then the euthanasia plan should have been enacted then and there. There's no way for her to ignore Zeke's rule of the royal bloodline if she hasn't broken free. Zeke also states that she was unable to disobey King Fritz. Not that she didn't want to, she was unwilling, she was unable to disobey King Fritz, and thus obeyed his bloodline for all those years because of blank. This is answered in 139 with that blank being love, and the rest of our equation is completed. It seems that every time with Ymir, the story gives us an equation 4 plus y equals 10. But it ends up trying to convince us that the answer to y was actually 7 the entire time. When I go back and look at the chapters and you read the information given, I say, wait, 7 literally doesn't make the equation add up. It just doesn't work. Whew, that was definitely a lot. I tried to get out all my various thoughts about the ideas on this iceberg that I've been cultivating over the last few years. Just as I was rereading, I realized a lot of things. One of them was that I skipped one of the points on the iceberg talking about Armin's final moment with Mueller where he tries to convince them. If you guys didn't realize, this was a direct parallel to season 1's scene where he tries to protect Eren and Mikasa by convincing the garrison and the guards that they're not a threat. And in season 1 he actually uses good logic, but the whole point of the scene is that humanity's fear can sometimes overrule logic, which is why if Eren wasn't there, they die, even though Armin actually had good logic and he explained it well. But in this scene, it's literally the same scene, except he uses worse logic. His logic doesn't even make sense. He says, if they were Titans, then they would have transformed by now. even though Marley knows about Titan shifters and all of them. Like it's bad logic, but in this scene it actually works somehow, which I guess if the message is to be like humanity is trying to change and the fear is different. But like I said, he doesn't. The scene doesn't make sense because he doesn't use good logic. If he had used good logic, like in season 1, maybe that could show like these were the parts of humanity that were trying to change. But it kind of goes against the whole idea of AOT that, I mean, even extra pages reinforces like, oh, the cycle, it will continue, you know, without exception, blah blah blah. So it's just kind of weird. I just missed that in the video. Also, when reading through, I noticed a few things. One, in 138, when Mikasa gets saved by Falco after Armin explodes in 137, and they think Eren is dead for like 10 seconds, her head starts throbbing because she saw it and she just lost Eren, which, you know, okay, that confirms what we thought earlier. Her head throbs whenever she's about to lose her family. But like I said, if we try to combine that with the context of Ymir looking through her head at that specific moment, it doesn't make any sense because that's a fight. Like, this is a moment Ymir is actually in our story. Like, throughout the story, obviously Ymir's never been there. We didn't know about Ymir until 120 or until 120, and then Ymir was only present like physically, or we don't even know if she was physically there, but she was like in the story and relevant to our characters past 120. But this is a scene like 138. She's been fighting. She's literally supposed to be the ancient Titans fighting. She's at the scene. So why is she looking through Mikasa's head at the scene that she's literally at? Like, she's right there. She's on the Titan. Why is she looking through Mikasa's head at this point? It's just another thing that was like, wait, why is it throbbing now? Is this supposed to be Ymir looking, or did the context randomly change in the very last chapter? Also, Zeke says in 120 that he spent like an infinite amount of time in paths, and he somehow renounced the vow. Somehow, like, he doesn't say how, he just says I spent a lot of time and I did it. Like, he's just him, I guess. But it just goes to show how ironic it is that he was able to pull off this feat of basically breaking one of the universe's rules. Like, this was just like a rule that the king had set, and Zeke just somehow managed to like break it with infinite time and research and paths. But with that same infinite time and research, he had never once changed his anti-natalist ideology, but Armin convinces him in like 5 minutes with something that he already knew. It just makes 137 look a little more silly in retrospect, especially with this information. This was given to us in 120, but just everybody kind of forgets about Zeke saying that, you know, he just destroyed the bond. Like, he just destroyed the vow. He didn't even explain how. He just kind of did it. And then also in 139, we've looked at 139. If you've watched AOT for so long, you've read 139 so many times. But it's kind of overlooked how Isayama he put in conversations that he said happened off screen that were like super important to our main characters, and like made it so that they went from calling Eren this like mass murderer, slaughterer, evil person to like crying for him and saying what a man he is. Like, they switched up fast, and we are never shown these conversations. Like, I just want everybody to know, regardless of how you feel about the crying for Eren or whatever, doesn't actually matter. We're just never shown the conversations. Like, imagine in Demon Slayer if like Muzan in the final fight, like the screen cuts to black and then Muzan is like defeated, right? And Tanjiro is just like, oh wow, we had a split-second conversation while we were fighting, and he said he actually was just a nice guy who wanted humans to live, but, you know, blah blah blah, all this stuff, and he was just like completely opposite to what his character was the entire time. Man, I'm so surprised, guys. And then he just tells us that it happened off screen, and we never see the conversation. Like, that's what we got in 139. We actually got that. Out of all the characters, I'm also surprised that we didn't get a Reiner POV. Like, okay, we don't get a Connie Eren conversation. Okay, sure, I can understand that. Maybe we didn't get a Eren Peak conversation, but an Eren Reiner conversation, like a character battle that has kind of been important throughout the entire series. He's almost been our main character on the other side. The fact that we just don't get any conversation from them, and we only get one from Armin, and like a half conversation if you consider the cabin, that a conversation in 138 is just like crazy, bro. 139, man. 139 is the chapter of all chapters. There's no other way to describe it, man. For anybody wondering, I still do love AOT. Obviously, I look at it differently than I did pre-ending. I think it's kind of impossible for one not to, unless you're just like a super glazer or something. Um, but I think one of the biggest issues I've seen is that people refuse to actually think or accept criticism for their favorite things because they're too concerned with maintaining their GOAT agenda. That was me, by the way. When the ending first came out, I was like a super speed reader. I had speed read to catch up to 139 when it was about to be released. I couldn't have told you a thing about the story, honestly. I missed so much. All I cared about was people liking it because I just wanted to keep calling it my GOAT because I loved season 1 through 3 of the anime so much. I was ready to call it the greatest anime ever, even when I didn't watch anything else, and I just wanted other people to love it too. I think it sucks now that people just say like lame one-liners instead of actually having a discussion. Like, you know how many times I've seen, oh, you didn't understand the story, or you know, you were never a real fan. What? I don't really think it's that hard to understand that somebody who really loved the story might have a lot of passion if they think that something that in the story was bad. If X or Y was bad, I think a guy who really loved the story might have a little bit more passion than just somebody who like glazed and didn't actually interpret the story or try to make any effort to read the dialogue. You don't have to love something or think it's perfect to be a fan or to really like something. I will say AOT is probably one of, if not the only anime that I've spent like time analyzing. Like if you asked me to analyze the character beats of Hunter x Hunter, I probably couldn't, even though I've watched all of Hunter x Hunter and I've watched all of Bleach. I couldn't tell you the amount of stuff, details, story notes and stuff like that, character development. I couldn't list out those things for those stories because I just haven't spent time doing it like I have for AOT. Like those stories, I think it's perfectly fine to just consume something and either like it or not like it. You don't even have to really know why you didn't like it. That's not necessary. But engaging in these conversations is always good. Like I said, if you guys disagree with any of these points, please, I'm begging, comment down below. I actually enjoy talking about these, even if, you know, all of these points have probably been, you've probably heard most of these in the past 5 years. I wanted to elucidate on them a little bit more, see if I could get opinions out there that I hadn't seen as much, or try to make it very clear why a certain thing is the way it is, or why you can't interpret it in certain ways. Especially now that the fandom is just like, it's kind of like devolved into like ship wars or either or scenarios where you either hate it or you love it and there's no in between, and it's just kind of weird. But I hope you guys enjoyed. This was like the longest video I've probably ever made. I put a lot of time into this, especially writing, and I hope you guys enjoyed.